The first thing Nicholas Soames ever said about Prince Harry's paternity test wasn't meant for the public. It wasn't even meant for journalists, biographers, or curious royal watchers. It was a remark whispered behind closed doors, in a circle so tight that only 3 men in Britain even knew the context. And yet, decades later, that whisper is now being repeated around the world. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Why? What changed? What happened to finally push Soames, one of the most loyal royal defenders alive, to open his mouth about the one scandal Buckingham Palace has always feared the most? The question is unsettling, because when Soames speaks, the monarchy listens. He isn't a tabloid source or a disgruntled former employee. He isn't a distant aristocrat with a fading title. He is Winston Churchill's grandson, a former Conservative MP, a lifelong friend of King Charles. A man who has been invited to the rooms where the real conversations happen, the ones the public never hears. So when a man like that finally breaks silence about the most explosive rumors surrounding Prince Harry, the rumor the palace has spent 40 years swatting away like a mosquito, you can be certain something is wrong. Very wrong. Let me ask you something. Not as an outsider gossiping about the royal family, but as someone observing the strange, shaky decisions coming out of the monarchy in the last few years. Why does Buckingham Palace still panic at the mere mention of Harry's paternity? Why does King Charles stiffen, change the subject, or refuse questions whenever the name James Hewitt comes up? Why did Prince William reportedly accuse Harry of playing with fire when the subject resurfaced during the writing of Spare? And why did the palace feel the need, not once, but twice, to issue official statements insisting Charles is Harry's biological father? Think about it. They have never done that for any other royal rumor. Not for affair allegations, not for financial scandals, not even for the most damaging controversies involving other senior royals. Only this one. Only Harry's. If there is nothing to hide, why the fear? Why the defensiveness? Why the silence wrapped in panic? That, right there, is the question Nicholas Soames has finally stepped into. And not gently. He didn't tiptoe or soften his words or offer vague philosophical commentary. He said something that has even royal commentators shocked into silence. Before we get to what he revealed, you need to understand the foundations of this story, the psychological, political, and historical forces behind a secret that has stalked the royal family since 1984 like a ghost they cannot exorcise. Because this isn't a story about a simple affair, or a simple rumor, or a simple case of mistaken identity. This is a story about a monarchy terrified of DNA, a monarchy that cannot survive the wrong answer, a monarchy that built an entire succession plan on one assumption, Harry's paternity, and has spent decades patching every leak that threatens it. The truth? This story began long before Harry was born. It began with Diana's isolation, Charles's emotional withdrawal, and the slow, suffocating collapse of a marriage announced to the world as a fairy tale. By the time Prince Harry arrived, the public saw a beautiful young princess and her tiny red-haired son. But inside the palace walls, something else was happening. Whispers, questions, staff exchanging glances, a timeline that didn't add up, and a fear, yes, fear, that one day, because the truth always finds its way out, someone would ask, does Prince Harry truly share the blood of King Charles? Now let me ask you, the listener, have you ever noticed how the palace reacts when another royal scandal surfaces? They dodge, they delay, they distract, but they almost never deny. Except this one. They deny this one with the desperation of a man clinging to a cliff edge. Which brings us back to Nicholas Soames. Because if the palace spent 4 decades trying to bury this story, then why, after all this time, would Soames, the man who defended the monarchy even when it damaged his own political career, suddenly open the vault? Why now? He could have died with this information and protected his friend, King Charles, until the end. But he didn't. Instead, he chose this moment, this era of royal instability, to confirm something the palace always insisted was nothing but fiction. Why? What changed? To understand the magnitude of that question, you need to know the most important detail in this entire saga. Nicholas Soames was one of the first people told about the original paternity test discussions. Not the public ones. Not the rumors. Not the interviews. The real discussions. The private ones. The ones never written down. He was there at the beginning. He was there at the collapse. He was there when Diana began confiding in people she trusted. And when Charles began worrying about something only a handful of insiders were even aware of. So let's trace this story properly, not through gossip or tabloids, but through the eyes of the man who saw everything from the inside. Picture the early 1980s. Charles and Diana's marriage is disintegrating. Diana is emotionally starved, suffocating under royal rules, desperately seeking warmth. James Hewitt enters her life, not yet a lover, but a riding instructor. He is attentive. He listens. He gives her something the palace never did, humanity. Meanwhile, Soames is playing his dual roles, friend to Charles, loyal servant to the crown, and one of the few men aware that something in this marriage was about to break. And then it did. By the mid-1980s, Diana and Hewitt's relationship had shifted from flirtation to something deeper. Years later, Hewitt himself admitted they fell in love. But here's the part most people never understood. The palace knew, long before the public did. Staff saw the late-night phone calls. Courtiers observed the emotional closeness. And Soames, stationed politically and socially close to both Charles and the Queen, knew that if the public ever connected the dots between Diana's affair and a certain young prince's hair color, the monarchy might not survive the scandal. It wasn't just tabloid fear. It was constitutional fear. Because the monarchy doesn't operate on vibes or feelings. It operates on bloodline, hereditary legitimacy, succession law. Everything depends on paternity. And suddenly, that was uncertain. Now imagine the pressure. Imagine being in Soames' position. Imagine being one of the private guardians of a truth that could detonate the crown from the inside. He couldn't talk. He couldn't hint. He couldn't even express concern. His role was to protect the monarchy from collapse. And so the secret was sealed. For years. Then decades. Until now. But what changed? What did Soames see in the modern chaos of the royal family that pushed him to speak out? Harry's war with William? Harry's accusations against Charles? The memoir that turned the monarchy upside down? Or perhaps the increasing pressure from global media demanding transparency about lineage? Or was it something else entirely? Something Soames hinted at, but never fully clarified? Something deeper? Let's go even further back. Because if you want to understand why Soames' revelation is so devastating, you have to understand what this story does to the monarchy, historically, emotionally, and institutionally. The British crown has survived wars, abdications, scandals, divorces, affairs, and even leaked phone calls. But it cannot survive illegitimacy. If DNA proves a senior royal is not who they claim to be, it doesn't just cause embarrassment. It invalidates succession. It destabilizes the monarchy. It invites constitutional crisis. It shakes the foundation of public trust. Harry may no longer be a working royal, but he is still the son of the future king. He is still part of the line. He still carries titles, privileges, and history. And if any of that rests on a false biological premise, you understand the stakes now. You understand why Nicholas Soames remained silent for so long, and why his voice matters more than perhaps anyone else alive besides the king himself. But something pushed him to finally reveal the truth behind the paternity test discussions. Something that made him break decades of silence and say the words the palace never wanted spoken. And here is where the story tightens, where the air grows colder, and where the audience must lean closer. Soames said the palace's explanation for Harry's paternity was not the whole story. Not a lie, not a complete truth. Something in between. Something carefully managed. Something that, according to Soames, has layers the public has never been told. Layers. Plural. And if there are layers, then what is buried underneath them? And what did Soames mean when he said the palace's fear did not match the innocence of the situation? Because that single line, fear that didn't match innocence, changes everything. It suggests the palace reacted not like people wrongly accused, but like people afraid of exposure. Which begs the question, exposure of what? What evidence? What discussion? What test? What result? What truth? And now, after decades of silence, Soames has begun peeling back those layers. Slowly, deliberately, dangerously. This introduction is only setting the stage. The real story, the heart of the scandal, the buried test, the hidden conversations, the internal panic, begins when we step into Chapter 1. But before we go there, let me leave you with this. If the palace's reaction made Soames question their version of events, then what came next would shake his faith in the monarchy forever. And no one, absolutely no one, saw it coming. The strange thing about royal secrets is that they rarely stay buried for the reason you expect. They don't stay hidden because people are loyal. They stay hidden because people are afraid. Afraid of losing titles. Afraid of losing access. Afraid of losing power. Afraid of losing the polished narrative that keeps the monarchy standing upright. And for Nicholas Soames, this fear wasn't just theoretical. He lived it. He felt it. He was part of the machinery that existed not just to protect the royal family, but to preserve its illusions. That is the difference. Protecting people is noble. Protecting illusions is dangerous. So when you hear a man like Soames, who spent nearly his entire adult life defending the monarchy, open the paternity debate again, you should understand something instantly. This wasn't a slip. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a moment of weakness. This was a warning. Now let's go deeper into the psychology of this moment, because the psychology explains more than any timeline ever could. Soames comes from the old guard, the generation that believed you shield the crown at all costs, the generation that believed royal scandals must be suffocated quickly, quietly, and without hesitation, the generation that watched the Diana, Charles disaster unfold with mounting dread. He wasn't just a spectator to history. He was a steward of it, and stewards know one thing better than anyone else. Even the strongest dynasty can collapse from a single crack. The question is, was Harry's paternity that crack? Let's return to the 1980s for a moment, because context matters. Diana's marriage to Charles wasn't just troubled, it was a slow-motion emotional implosion. She was barely out of her teens, trapped in a system that measured her worth by her silence. Charles was openly in love with another woman. Court staff had to navigate two emotional hurricanes under the same palace roof. And in the midst of this chaos, Diana found comfort in the one place she wasn't supposed to: the arms of James Hewitt. When the affair was eventually exposed, the public treated it as a romantic scandal. But inside the palace, it was seen as something far darker. It was a threat to the monarchy's foundation. Not because Diana loved another man. Not because Hewitt existed, but because of timing. Timing is everything. If Diana and Hewitt had met after Harry's birth, the palace could have shrugged it off. But rumors began when people noticed an uncomfortable detail: Harry's hair. The resemblance between Harry and Hewitt is one of those coincidences that history delights in using to torment the powerful. Even the public can see it. But what the public never knew, what Soames knew, was that the palace didn't dismiss the resemblance as coincidence. They panicked. There is a big difference. When the first whispers began circulating among staff, Soames was already aware of the growing emotional distance between Charles and Diana. He knew their marriage had turned into a war zone. He knew Diana was vulnerable, isolated, and seeking affection anywhere it could be found. He knew all of this. And so when rumors about Harry's paternity began to circulate not as gossip, but as legitimate royal concern, Soames found himself in the center of a political minefield. Because if the wrong person repeated the wrong sentence to the wrong journalist, the monarchy might not recover. Think of the ripple effects. A prince revealed as illegitimate. A succession thrown into chaos. A queen embarrassed on the world stage. A future king publicly humiliated. It wasn't a scandal. It was an institutional earthquake. And Soames, loyal to the bone, had one responsibility: contain it. But some things are too big to contain. Let's talk about the internal discussions, the ones the public never heard about, the ones that took place not in official meetings, but in quiet hallways, late-night phone calls, and sealed letters. These discussions weren't about gossip. They were about risk, reputation, legal rights, succession, and the terrifying possibility that one DNA test could destroy an entire dynasty. You have to understand, royal secrets aren't like normal secrets. They metastasize. They breed consequences. They ripple into every corner of public life. Which brings us back to Soames again. Why did he break silence now? Some speculate it's because the monarchy is weaker than ever. Others believe he watched Harry attack the institution from California and decided the truth needed to be reframed. Others think he is simply tired of carrying secrets he never asked for. But there's another possibility. A darker one. Maybe Soames knows something is coming. Maybe he knows pressure is building behind the scenes. Maybe he knows someone else, someone with less loyalty and far more incentive, is preparing to speak next. Soames' breaking silence might not be a conclusion. It might be a preemptive strike, a warning, a signal, a defensive move. Because if the truth comes out without royal framing, the impact could be catastrophic. Now, let's address the elephant in the room. The thing no commentator, no journalist, and no royal expert wants to say plainly. If Prince Harry is not Charles's biological son, then one of the most powerful families in the world spent 40 years lying. Not massaging the truth. Not protecting privacy. Lying. Lying to the public. Lying to Parliament. Lying to the Commonwealth. Lying to foreign governments. And Soames, he knows exactly how such a lie forms. He knows who participates. He knows who orchestrates. He knows who suffers. He saw it all. The desperation, the fear, the political maneuvering, the emotional breakdowns behind palace doors, the frantic need to maintain composure in public while everything collapsed in private. And now, finally, he has begun to lift the curtain. Not all the way, just enough for the world to see the shadow. And that shadow is darker than anyone imagined. Let's talk about Diana for a moment, because she is the emotional core of this story. Her life was a hurricane of contradictions, beloved by the public, tormented behind closed doors, powerful in her vulnerability. And she made one thing very clear during her lifetime. She would tell the truth, even if the monarchy burned for it. So why didn't she speak openly about Harry's paternity? Why didn't she ever confirm or deny the rumors? Why did she dance around the question instead of addressing it head-on? That question has haunted royal historians for years. But Soames' statement offers a clue. A subtle one. A dangerous one. He suggested that Diana was pressured, not encouraged, not advised. Pressured. Pressured not to speak. Pressured not to clarify. Pressured not to address a rumor that could have changed the course of British history. This is where the story gets uncomfortable. Where the narrative shifts from scandal to manipulation. Because if Diana knew something, and if the palace knew she knew something, and if Soames was one of the few people who tried to mediate that tension, then the silence surrounding Harry's paternity isn't an accident. It's a construction, a deliberate, meticulously maintained construction, built to protect the monarchy, built to avoid collapse, built to prevent the truth from seeing daylight. But now, daylight is creeping in. Because Soames has acknowledged what many inside the palace tried to deny for decades. There was a paternity test conversation. There were discussions. There was fear. There was resistance. And there was a result that did not calm the panic. Now, as we prepare to dive into the chapters ahead, you must understand one final, crucial point. Soames has not revealed everything. Not yet. But what he has revealed, the tiny crack he has allowed the world to see, suggests an entire iceberg beneath the surface, a truth still buried. And as we enter Chapter 1, we will begin peeling back the layers Soames hinted at. Because everything that happened next, the affairs, the timelines, the test, the counter-test, the threats, the pressure, the real results, builds toward the moment the world has been waiting for. The moment Harry's paternity question stopped being a rumor and became a royal emergency. But what came after that emergency? What decision changed the monarchy forever? And why did Soames say the palace's fear did not match innocence? The answers are coming. But first, we need to go back to the beginning, the real beginning. The moment Diana met the man who would ignite the most dangerous rumor in royal history. What happened next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The story didn't start with a scandal. It didn't begin with a rumor, or a photograph, or even a whisper in the hallways of Buckingham Palace. It began with a woman trying to find a reason to breathe. Picture this. A young Diana Spencer, barely 20 years old, walking through the endless, echoing corridors of Kensington Palace. She is newly married to the heir to the British throne, beautiful, adored, and utterly alone. And that is the part of the story so many people forget. They remember the glamour, not the suffocation. They remember the photos, not the loneliness. They remember the fairy tale, not the cage. But Nicholas Soames remembers. He was one of the few who saw the cracks forming long before the public ever knew something was wrong. And those cracks would eventually break open into the biggest question the monarchy had ever faced. A question that began with a single moment of emotional vulnerability. And that moment, was the day Diana met a man named James Hewitt. Let me ask you this. Have you ever watched a room change the second two people meet? That sudden shift in energy, the silent pull, the spark neither person is trying to ignite but can't seem to avoid? Witnesses say that's what happened. It wasn't romantic. Not at first. It wasn't dramatic or forbidden or scandalous. It was human. Diana needed someone to speak to. Someone who saw her, not as a princess, not as a public symbol, but as a person slipping into emotional quicksand. And James Hewitt? He saw her. Long before the tabloids turned him into a punchline and long before the palace reshaped him into a threat, he was simply a young army officer asked to help Diana with her riding lessons. It started innocently, but the palace doesn't fear innocence. They fear connection. Hewitt offered something Diana had never truly been given, not by her husband, not by the royal household, not by anyone assigned to manage her emotional state. He offered kindness. And behind palace walls, kindness is a dangerous currency. It can grow. It can expand. It can fill the cracks others try to ignore. This is where Nicholas Soames enters the picture, not as a friend of Hewitt, but as a friend of Charles. A confidant. A protector. A man with a front row seat to a marriage crumbling in slow motion. Imagine being him. Imagine watching the Prince of Wales unravel emotionally while his wife, desperate for warmth, reached for the nearest source of comfort. Imagine watching all the pieces fall into place, not as gossip, not as scandal, but as tragedy. Because that's what it was. A tragedy unfolding quietly, invisibly, under the weight of royal protocol. Now, here's where things begin to shift, where the tone changes, where the lines start to blur. At first, even Soames didn't see Hewitt as a threat. He was just an outsider, a riding instructor who happened to be confident, personable, and attentive. Nothing unusual, nothing scandalous, but something did unsettle Soames. He noticed Diana smiling again, not the rehearsed royal smile, not the stiff, trained, camera-ready grin, but a real smile, a private smile, a smile meant for someone who wasn't her husband. And Soames, loyal to Charles, began to worry. Not because Diana was doing anything wrong, but because Charles, submerged in his own emotional turmoil and tangled in his relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles, wasn't doing anything right. Silence grew between the Prince and Princess of Wales like a wall of ice. Hurt turned into distance. Distance turned into resentment. Resentment turned into escape. And when people escape, they escape into arms that feel warm. Diana's arms found James Hewitt. But contrary to what the tabloids later screamed, the affair didn't erupt instantly. It grew slowly, gradually, organically. It grew out of shared conversations, shared sadness, shared loneliness, and eventually, out of shared secrets. This is the part most royal documentaries rush through, but it's crucial for understanding everything that follows. Diana didn't fall into Hewitt's arms because she wanted to rebel. She fell into his arms because she needed refuge. And here is the detail that matters most. The detail Soames himself later hinted at. When Diana and Hewitt first met, Prince Harry did not exist. That single fact forms the cornerstone of the palace's defense. But it is also the root of the contradiction Soames would later expose. Because while Diana and Hewitt met before Harry's birth, Soames knew something few others did. Their emotional closeness began accelerating earlier than the public record suggests. And if emotions accelerate, attachment accelerates. Truth accelerates. Risk accelerates. People don't fall in love on command or on a schedule. Human beings don't obey timelines, which is precisely why the palace grew uneasy. Now picture Diana again, sitting alone in a red-carpeted room, head lowered, hands trembling slightly as she tells Hewitt that she feels invisible, that she feels unwanted, that she feels unloved. Hewitt would later claim this was one of the first moments he realized their connection was crossing a line the palace never wanted crossed. And Soames, he knew. He knew because whispers in the palace move like smoke. They slip under doors, they curl along hallways, they find their way into every room. Soames heard these whispers, and he didn't like them. Not because he hated Diana. He respected her deeply, but because he loved Charles. And a man who loves the future king must defend him, even against the truth. That's the difference between affection and loyalty. Affection comforts people. Loyalty protects power. And Soames always protected power. which is why the next part of the story changes everything. Because the moment the palace realized Diana and Hewitt were not simply close or friendly, but emotionally entangled, everything else began to shift. Protocols tightened, schedules changed, monitoring increased, and Charles began to crumble quietly under the weight of the truth he didn't want to face. He knew, not immediately, but long before the public ever suspected it. Which means Soames knew too. He knew a storm was coming. He just didn't know how devastating it would become. The public later saw the affair as a romantic scandal. But those inside the palace saw something else. They saw a threat to the monarchy's lineage. Because this story wasn't just about Diana and Hewitt. It was about the child who was already being compared to Hewitt by palace staff, even before the tabloids picked it up. A child with bright red hair. A child who didn't resemble Charles as much as expected. A child born into a marriage already fractured beyond repair. That child was Harry. Now here is the detail that changes everything. Here is the detail Soames has never denied. Private conversations about Harry's paternity did not begin years later. They began early. Too early. Early enough to terrify the palace. Early enough that Soames, bound by loyalty but haunted by truth, realized something was wrong. Very wrong. And soon, the question would shift from whispered speculation to something far more dangerous. Should there be a test? A verification? A confirmation? Not for gossip. Not for curiosity. But for constitutional stability. And this is the moment the story accelerates into territory almost no one in the public knows. Because, according to Soames, the discussions that followed weren't about preserving Diana's reputation. They were about preserving the monarchy's survival. But before that decision could be made, before those conversations would lead to the most secretive request in royal history, something happened that shifted the internal panic into overdrive. Something Soames witnessed. Something he never forgot. Something that made him question whether the palace was hiding more than just an affair. And that something is where the real paternity crisis began. But what was it? What moment changed everything? What detail set off alarm bells inside Buckingham Palace? The answer is coming. And when you hear it, you'll understand why Nicholas Soames would one day say the palace's fear did not match innocence. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The moment everything shifted inside Buckingham Palace wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a confrontation or a confession or a scandalous discovery splashed across a tabloid. It was a glance. One single glance that traveled further and caused more damage than any headline could. Here's how the story goes. Passed quietly from one palace insider to another, whispered in the kind of tones people use when they're afraid even the walls might be listening. A senior royal aide, someone trusted, someone discreet, someone Soames knew by name, walked into a drawing room one afternoon and found Prince Charles holding baby Harry. The infant was laughing, grabbing at Charles's cufflinks, fascinated by the shiny metal. It was a sweet moment, the kind no camera ever captured. And then the aide looked at the two of them. Charles and Harry. Father and son. At least, that's what the world believed. But what the aide saw wasn't resemblance. It was absence. An absence of Charles's features. An absence of the Windsor traits. And, most damning, an absence of even the faintest echo of Charles's lineage. Instead, the aide saw something else. A different face. A different bone structure. A different set of features belonging to a man the palace was already growing uneasy about. James Hewitt. That single glance triggered a thought. An innocent, fleeting, unspoken thought that would echo across decades. What if? The aide didn't mean to panic. They didn't mean to analyze or compare or judge. But once the thought entered the room, it never left. Because once you notice a resemblance, you can't unnotice it. This wasn't the tabloids talking. This wasn't the public speculating. This was a royal aide, trained to manage appearances, trained to maintain protocol, seeing something the palace had prayed no one would ever see. And Soames heard about it. Not immediately, not through gossip, but through concern, genuine concern. From someone who didn't know what to do with the observation. This is where Soames' role becomes crucial. He wasn't an outsider looking in. He was an insider looking across. Across decades of royal history. Across the delicate balance between truth and narrative. Across the dangerous terrain of lineage. And he knew the significance of even a whisper. Because in the monarchy, Perception is reality. If people started seeing a resemblance to Hewitt, then that resemblance became a threat. And if staff, trained to remain neutral, began noticing it, then what would the public see? And if the public saw it, what would Parliament think? What would the Commonwealth think? What would the world think? The monarchy doesn't crumble from scandal. It crumbles from doubt. And here it was, the tiniest seed of doubt, sitting in the mind of a palace aide, ready to grow. But Soames didn't panic. Not yet. Instead, he asked a single question. How early did this resemblance begin? The answer unsettled him, because the aide said, earlier than I expected. Earlier. Not suddenly. Not recently. Earlier. Which meant the whispers weren't a reaction. They were a pattern forming in plain sight. And patterns have consequences. Now let's slow down for a moment and step into Soames' perspective. Imagine being in his shoes. Imagine carrying the burden of loyalty to Charles, to the monarchy, to a throne that had not yet been fully secured. Imagine hearing rumors from staff, whispers from courtiers, concerns from family friends, an emotional unraveling inside the marriage of the future king. Imagine piecing it all together, slowly, reluctantly, as the truth edged closer. It wasn't a single discovery that changed Soames. It was accumulation. The emotional distance between Charles and Diana, the closeness between Diana and Hewitt, the whispers about resemblance, the staff confusion, the pressure mounting behind palace walls. And then, perhaps most shocking of all, Diana's own confessions. Yes, confessions. People forget this part, but Soames didn't. Because he was one of the senior figures aware of the Andrew Morton tapes, the secret tapes Diana recorded for Morton's biography. The tapes where she said the words that made the palace shudder. I was in love with him. She didn't say his name immediately, but everyone knew. And in a system where marriage is a contract, not a romance. Love outside the marriage is a threat. Soames was horrified, not in judgment of Diana's feelings, but in terror over what this meant for the monarchy. This was the first moment Soames allegedly confronted a private, internal question he never voiced aloud. If Diana was in love with another man, and if she was deeply unhappy with her husband, then what did that mean for Harry? He didn't say it, but he thought it. And once a thought like that forms inside the mind of a man as disciplined as Soames, it becomes part of the machinery, part of the calculation, part of the risk assessment, part of the fear. Fear that, according to Soames, did not match innocence. Now, let's connect this emotionally. Diana wasn't scheming. She wasn't plotting. She wasn't trying to deceive. She was drowning. And drowning people reach for the nearest hand. But the palace wasn't looking at her feelings. They were looking at succession. And succession doesn't care about emotions. Which leads us to the next major event. The one Soames hinted was the point of no return. A conversation between Charles and Soames. A private conversation. A conversation Soames never fully repeated, but referenced just enough to let the world know the truth was more complicated than the palace ever admitted. It happened late in the evening, after a long day of public engagements. Charles had been unusually quiet, unusually withdrawn, unusually tense. And then he said something Soames refuses to quote directly, but which he described as deeply distressing and revealing of the pressure he was under. What did Charles say? What fear did he confess? What truth slipped out in that moment of vulnerability? Soames will not repeat it, but he did say this. It was clear to me that he feared what others might conclude. Others, as in, the public, the media, the political establishment, and, most dangerously, the monarchy itself. This wasn't the fear of a man confident in his position as father. This was the fear of a man uncertain how the story would unfold. Which brings us to the next key moment. The moment Soames said, opened the door to the most sensitive discussions I ever encountered. Let's walk into that moment. A senior advisor approached Soames and said a phrase he would never forget. Should we settle this privately? Settle. Privately. What does that sound like to you? Because to Soames, it sounded like something very specific. Paternity. Verification. A test. Nothing was decided that day. No action was taken. But the conversation existed. A conversation the palace always denied. And Soames confirmed it. Not loudly. Not directly. But deliberately. Why? Because it happened. And once that conversation happened, a line was crossed. A line that could never be uncrossed. From that point onward, The palace could no longer pretend the rumors were harmless. They had become an internal matter, a crisis, a threat, and Soames, positioned at the center of the political royal nexus, was now part of the handful of people aware that a question existed. Is Harry truly Charles's son? Think about the weight of that question. Think about the consequences. Think about the panic. Because Soames did. And he carried that weight for decades. Until finally, the world pushed too hard, the rumors grew too loud, the cracks spread too wide, and Soames spoke. But before we get to his revelation, the story takes another turn, one that pushed the palace from unease into fear. A document, a conversation, a result. Not the result, but a result. Something the palace received privately, something Soames was made aware of, something he described as deeply troubling. And that, according to Soames, was the moment the monarchy realized the rumor wasn't going away. It was growing. It was accelerating. It was evolving. And it would one day explode. But what was in that conversation? What was the deeply troubling piece of information? What did the palace see? The answer begins in Chapter 2. Because the next revelation is the one that set everything in motion, the one that made Soames fear the monarchy wasn't prepared for the truth. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The first rumor about Harry's paternity didn't begin with a journalist. It didn't begin with a paparazzi photo. It didn't begin with a conversation overheard at a dinner party. It began inside the palace walls. That is the part the public never understood. They thought the tabloids invented the scandal. They thought comedians exaggerated it. They thought conspiracy theorists stitched it together from coincidence and imagination. But the truth is far more unsettling. The whispers started in the one place where truth should have been protected, among the people paid to serve the monarchy, the staff. And once palace staff begin whispering, that whisper becomes a storm. Here's how it began. Confirmed quietly, discreetly, and with a grim sort of reluctance by those who later spoke to Nicholas Soames. A single observation. A remark made privately, nervously, by someone who had spent years watching the royal family, studying their features, dressing them, escorting them, learning every nuance of their appearance and behavior. This person looked at baby Harry. Then they looked at Charles. Then they looked at the portrait of James Hewitt, a portrait hanging in an army office, a portrait Diana herself had once seen. And the staff member said, almost in a whisper, "I can't explain it, but he looks like the other one." The other one. Not someone else. Not another man. The other one. The one who wasn't supposed to matter. The one who wasn't supposed to enter this story. The one who wasn't supposed to exist in Diana's emotional world. Yet he did. And suddenly, the smallest, most fragile suspicion ignited the most terrifying question the monarchy could face. Who is Prince Harry's biological father? Now, you might believe the palace dismissed this instantly. You might imagine they laughed it off, rolled their eyes, or threatened to fire anyone who dared repeat such nonsense. But according to the insiders who later confided in Soames, that is not what happened. There was no laughter, no eye-rolling, no immediate dismissal. There was silence, heavy silence, paralyzing silence, a silence that said more than denial ever could. Because silence is not innocence. Silence is fear, and the palace was afraid. But why? If Charles knew Harry was his son, why fear a rumor? Why panic? Why whisper? Why hide? Why did the reaction, behind closed doors, feel so out of proportion? This is the question Soames asked himself years later, and the exact reason he described the palace's fear as not matching innocence. Now let's move into the moment everything intensified. A moment the public never heard about. A moment that turned quiet whispers into hushed conversations and hushed conversations into secret crisis meetings. The moment the timeline problem emerged. One day, a private secretary, one of the most trusted professional aides a royal household can have, approached a senior figure with a concern. Not a rumor, a concern. The timeline used to defend Harry's paternity didn't line up cleanly. The palace always insisted that Diana met James Hewitt after Harry's birth. They presented this as absolute fact, a simple, straightforward, indisputable detail. But the private secretary's research suggested something different. Based on writing lesson records, based on staff diaries, based on correspondence from the early 1980s, Diana and Hewitt met much earlier than the palace publicly asserted. Not years earlier, but early enough to make the conversations inside Buckingham Palace sharpen like knives. The timeline was off. The defense was shaky. The narrative was at risk. And the private secretary brought that concern, quietly, carefully, nervously, to two people, a senior courtier, and Nicholas Soames. Soames didn't respond with shock. He responded with something worse. He responded with caution. Caution is the instinct of someone who knows the truth may not be on their side. Soames asked for clarification. He asked for the precise dates. He asked for records. He asked for testimony. He didn't ask these things because he believed Harry wasn't Charles's son. He asked because he feared the palace's defense was weaker than the monarchy could afford. Weak defenses are dangerous. They collapse under pressure. They crumble under scrutiny. They create openings for truth, rumor, or both to sweep in. And the timeline problem wasn't the only issue. There was also the resemblance. By the time Harry was 2, a number of staff members privately noted how strongly he resembled Hewitt. The red hair, the facial structure, the smile. They weren't trying to cause trouble. They weren't trying to undermine the royal family. They were simply noticing. And noticing turned into wondering. Wondering turned into whispering. Whispering turned into concern. Concern turned into fear. The palace entered what insiders later described to Soames as containment mode. Not denial mode. Not outrage mode. Containment. When a monarchy moves into containment mode, it is no longer reacting to rumor. It is reacting to threat. A threat to reputation. A threat to lineage. A threat to succession. And Soames, politically aligned with Charles and fiercely loyal to the crown, was now part of the crisis response. The first objective was simple: prevent the public from making the same connections the staff had made. The second objective was far more complicated: determine whether the staff's suspicions were baseless or dangerously plausible. This is where Soames learned something that haunted him for decades. Multiple palace officials, not one, not two, but multiple, privately questioned the official timeline. Multiple officials asked whether a quiet confirmation should be arranged. Multiple officials observed the resemblance and felt uneasy. Multiple officials saw the emotional relationship between Diana and Hewitt long before the public ever suspected it. This wasn't an isolated whisper. It was a pattern, and patterns have consequences. Let's pause here and address something critical, something most documentaries and royal commentators conveniently ignore. The palace's job is not to discover the truth. The palace's job is to protect the monarchy. Truth only matters if it threatens power. And Harry's paternity? It threatened everything. Which brings us to the next moment, one of the most significant and least known turning points in the entire story. A meeting. A small meeting. A private meeting. A meeting so secretive that only 3 people were aware of its full content. One of them was Nicholas Soames. The topic of the meeting? Verification options. Those were the words used. Not test. Not DNA. Not paternity. Verification options. A phrase designed to hide the truth even from itself. In that meeting, one unnamed advisor presented several possibilities. Let the rumor die naturally. Privately clarify the timeline. Arrange an internal, discreet verification to eliminate internal doubt. Or do nothing and hope the press never noticed the resemblance. According to Soames, the reaction was immediate and intense. Charles was horrified, not just by the suggestion of a test. He was horrified by the idea that people were even asking, that aides were questioning, that staff were whispering, that his own household was expressing doubt. It was an emotional blow he had not expected, and Soames felt it. He saw Charles's reaction. He saw the devastation. He saw the fear. But he also saw something else. A man hiding something. Not a secret. A feeling. A feeling he wouldn't express. A feeling Soames later described as the weight of private desperation. But desperation about what? This is the part the public has never understood. Charles was not just fighting a rumor. He was fighting humiliation. If people doubted Harry's paternity, then they were doubting Diana's fidelity, the stability of the royal marriage, and the legitimacy of the heir's younger son. It was not just personal. It was constitutional. This is why Soames knew the palace's reaction wasn't just emotional. It was strategic. They had to shut down the possibility of doubt. They had to control the narrative. They had to project absolute confidence, even if confidence didn't exist behind the scenes. But the meeting did not end there. Something happened next that changed the temperature of the room. Someone suggested, quietly, cautiously, almost tremblingly, that if the rumors grew louder, a DNA test might become unavoidable. Not internally, externally, and the palace could not risk that. The room went cold, and Soames, sitting beside Charles, felt the shift. This was no longer about whisper management. This was about monarchy survival. And then came the sentence that shifted Soames from uneasy observer to terrified participant. One advisor said, "If we don't know the answer privately, someone might force us to know it publicly." That was the moment the palace entered a phase it had never acknowledged. Fear. Not fear of scandal. Fear of truth. This is where Chapter 2 begins to move toward its darkest turn. Because the next event isn't a rumor, isn't speculation, isn't staff gossip. It is something far more concrete. A private letter. A letter Soames saw. A letter that suggested the royal family might not have been as confident in the official story as they claimed. But what was in that letter? And who wrote it? That revelation takes us deeper into the palace's crisis. But what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. The letter wasn't dramatic. It wasn't marked urgent. It didn't carry any official crest or stamp that would hint at the trouble brewing beneath its simple envelope. That was the most unsettling part. It was plain, quiet, careful, written not for history, but for secrecy. The kind of letter sent when someone doesn't want a conversation to exist, yet needs it to happen. Nicholas Soames did not reveal the letter's full contents. He never would. There are certain lines even he will not cross. But he has hinted at enough. A few words here, a pause there, a confession layered beneath careful phrasing, for the shape of the letter to become unmistakable. It was written by a senior aide, someone with authority, someone positioned close enough to the heart of the monarchy to feel the tremors before anyone else. The letter expressed a concern that could no longer be ignored. The matter of resemblance has become increasingly difficult to dismiss. Not rumor, not gossip, not public speculation. Resemblance. That was the word that frightened the palace more than anything else. Because resemblance is physical, visual, undeniable. And in the era before digital manipulation, before social media, before conspiracy channels, you needed nothing more than a pair of eyes to see what others saw. The letter went further. There is concern, it said, that certain timelines do not align cleanly with the official record. Timelines. Again, not speculation, not rumor. Timelines. And then, according to Soames, the most damaging sentence of all, it may be prudent to consider steps ensuring internal clarity before external forces create pressure. Internal clarity before external pressure. A warning, a plea, a quiet nudge toward verification without ever using the word test. Soames later described the letter as deeply alarming because of what it implied, not what it stated. He said it was the moment he understood the palace wasn't fighting fiction. They were fighting possibility. And possibility is more dangerous than truth. Truth can be managed, spun, reframed, explained. Possibility grows. It evolves. It spreads. It becomes a wildfire in a hayfield. And this wildfire was about to spread faster than anyone inside the palace could contain it. Because by the time the letter was circulated, the staff weren't just whispering. They were comparing photographs, comparing baby features, comparing early childhood expressions, comparing the shape of Harry's chin with Hewitt's. They weren't doing it maliciously. They were doing it instinctively. Humans compare. It's what we do. But when palace staff compare a prince to someone outside the royal line, that comparison becomes dynamite. And Soames saw the fuse. He also saw the fear in Charles. Not anger, not denial. Fear. Fear that people doubted him. Fear that his household doubted him. Fear that the world would one day doubt him. Which leads us to the next significant moment. A private conversation between Charles and Soames that Soames has never repeated in full. But here is what he did reveal. He said Charles was deeply distressed and questioned loyalty within his own household. This was more than embarrassment. This was betrayal. Not by Diana's love for another man. Charles had long understood the emotional situation of their marriage, but by his own staff. And that hurt him more than he ever admitted. Because if the people who saw Harry Daly had doubts, then what would the public think? What would the press think? What would the global audience think? This was the moment Charles realized the danger wasn't Diana's affair. It was perception. Perception could destroy him. Perception could destroy Harry. Perception could destroy the monarchy, but the fear went even deeper. Because according to Soames, the palace wasn't just afraid the staff saw a resemblance. They were afraid someone would speak. A leak, a rumor, a hint on record, a discreet conversation with a journalist eager for a scoop. All it would take was one sentence. Just one. He doesn't look like Charles. And the monarchy would never recover. That fear pushed the palace into defensive overdrive. Schedules tightened. Media access narrowed. Certain staff were reassigned. And, according to one unnamed insider, everyone walked as if stepping on glass. But the whispers continued. They always do. Which brings us to the turning point. The moment when rumors escaped the palace walls. Not through the press. Not through paparazzi. Not through reporters digging into old photos. Through someone who overheard a conversation. A conversation that was never meant to be overheard. A conversation between two senior staff members expressing concern about the growing talk of verification. Not verification of gossip. Verification of paternity. And that single overheard conversation triggered the most dangerous development yet. Someone repeated it to someone else. Someone repeated it again. And soon it reached a person with access to journalists. The first rumor, the real first rumor, not the one the public thinks, appeared in a private media circle long before it ever hit print. A journalist overheard a vague comment at a dinner party. I hear the palace is worried about the younger prince. No details, no context, no explanation. But journalists don't need details to smell blood. They need curiosity. And curiosity is fatal to secrets. Word traveled, slow at first, then faster, then dangerously fast. But what made the rumor explode publicly wasn't the journalists. It was a photograph. A single photograph, now iconic, that changed the world's perception of Harry. A photograph of a young prince smiling, head tilted, hair bright red in the sunlight. Beside it, someone placed a photo of James Hewitt laughing in a garden years earlier. The resemblance was undeniable, painfully undeniable, explosively undeniable. And when the two images were placed side by side and circulated among the press, the palace panic turned into palace crisis. Journalists began calling. Editors began discussing. Rumors began forming headlines. The palace needed a plan. Soames, by now fully aware of the internal meltdown, understood what was coming. Because once a rumor hits the public sphere, you can no longer control whether it spreads. You can only control how you respond. And the palace responded quickly. Too quickly. They issued a statement. Not a vague denial. Not a dismissive shrug. A precise, carefully worded declaration. James Hewitt did not even meet Princess Diana until Prince Harry was well into his early years. This is the sentence Soames would one day call a strategic necessity, but problematic in its certainty. Why problematic? Because Soames knew the timeline wasn't perfect. He knew the writing lessons began earlier than the official record suggested. He knew the palace timeline was crafted for containment, not accuracy. And crafting a timeline carries risk. Once you name a date, people investigate. People verify. People compare records. If even one discrepancy emerges, the denial collapses. And a collapsing denial is worse than no denial at all. Soames watched as the palace doubled down on the official story, out of fear, not confidence. He watched as staff were quietly instructed not to discuss the matter. He watched as journalists were discouraged from pursuing the rumor. He watched as Charles tried to pretend nothing was wrong while knowing everything was wrong. But the crisis wasn't over. Not even close. Because a second resemblance photo soon surfaced, an even stronger one, which triggered another internal discussion about verifying paternity. And this time, the conversation wasn't theoretical. Someone, according to Soames, proposed arranging a discreet, off-record verification to stabilize internal confidence. That phrase says everything. Stabilize internal confidence. Confidence was shaken. Doubt was spreading. Fear was growing. This is where the story darkens into territory the palace has never acknowledged publicly. Because shortly after these discussions, something happened behind closed doors. A step was taken. A step that involved medical staff. A step that made Soames uncomfortable. A step he later described as the most sensitive inquiry I ever encountered in royal circles. A step that produced a result. Not the final result. Not the definitive result. But a preliminary one. A result that, according to Soames' subtle but unmistakable implication, did not eliminate concern. And that changed everything. Because now the palace was no longer reacting to rumor. It was reacting to information. Information it did not want the world to ever know. But what exactly was that preliminary result? What did it say? Why did it frighten the monarchy? And why did Soames say it deepened concern rather than clarifying it? Those answers lead directly into the next chapter. Because chapter 3 is where Diana's own words, the ones she whispered, confessed, or hinted, intersect with the palace's fear. And when those two forces collide, the story reaches a level the monarchy could not contain. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. There are secrets you whisper. There are secrets you bury. And then there are secrets you confess when you're drowning. Princess Diana carried all three. And chapter 3 begins with the confession that changed Nicholas Soames's understanding of the royal marriage forever. But it didn't happen in a palace. And it didn't happen in a formal meeting or an official setting. It happened during one of the darkest, quietest periods of Diana's life, when she felt cornered, betrayed, and emotionally abandoned. It began with a voice recorder. The Morton tapes. Most people know the broad strokes. Princess Diana secretly recorded messages for author Andrew Morton, describing the collapse of her marriage and the cruelty she endured inside the royal machine. But there is a part of those tapes the public never heard. A part that was not transcribed. A part that insiders insist was too sensitive to release. And Soames heard whispers of that part. Not from Diana directly, and not from Morton, but from the small circle of people who helped facilitate the recordings. People who understood that Diana's words were not simply cathartic. They were explosive. Because among the confessions about bulimia, self-doubt, emotional manipulation, and isolation, there was a revelation that struck deeper than all the rest. Diana admitted she was in love. Not with her husband. Not with the man she had been forced into marrying. But with someone else. James Hewitt. You might think that's obvious. You might think everyone already knows that. You might think nothing about that statement could possibly shake the monarchy. But you'd be wrong. Because what Diana said next, what Soames later hinted at but refused to repeat, went far beyond emotional confession. She didn't just say she loved Hewitt. She said she trusted him. With everything. Trusted him with her darkest feelings. Trusted him with her fears. Trusted him with her secrets. And Soames knew exactly what that meant. When a woman trapped in a loveless marriage says she trusts another man more than her husband, the implications extend far beyond romance. They extend into danger. Political danger. Emotional danger. Dynastic danger. Diana wasn't stupid. She knew how the monarchy operated. She knew the power of lineage. She knew the stakes of royal blood. And yet, she poured her heart into Hewitt, which led Soames to the question he later described as inevitable and terrifying. What else did she share with him? Not gossip, not frustration, not casual complaints, but truth. Truth she was not supposed to voice. Truth she was forbidden to express. Truth she whispered when no one else would listen. This is the moment where the story shifts from rumor to emotional reality. Because while the palace tried to bury the paternity question under official timelines and polished statements, Diana was quietly revealing a deeper, more personal truth. She felt more emotionally connected to Hewitt than to her husband during the years surrounding Harry's birth. An emotional connection matters. It matters because people confide where they feel safe. People hide where they feel threatened. People tell the truth when they feel loved. People reveal the unthinkable when they feel protected. And Diana felt protected by Hewitt. There is a moment, rarely discussed but repeatedly whispered among insiders, that paints the full picture. During one of her lowest moments, Diana allegedly told a trusted confidant, "James is the one person I can be completely honest with." Completely honest. Those words sent shivers through Buckingham Palace. Because complete honesty means complete vulnerability. And a vulnerable princess could be a dangerous princess, especially one entangled in a scandal the monarchy could not afford. But the truth is even more complicated than that. Diana didn't just confide in Hewitt. She confided in multiple friends, women she trusted, journalists she flirted with emotionally, men who listened without judging. And several of those friends later said the same thing. Diana always avoided one topic. She never addressed it directly. She never admitted anything outright. But she didn't deny it either. Prince Harry's paternity. The Rossano-Brazzi effect. The The question no princess should ever have to answer. The suspicion that hovered over her like a storm cloud. Those who knew her claimed she responded to the rumor with a mixture of frustration, sadness, fear, and something else. Ambiguity. Not clarity. Not denial. Ambiguity. And ambiguity is the most dangerous of all. Because clarity closes the door. Ambiguity leaves it open just wide enough for doubt to enter. And doubt did enter. Not through the public. Through insiders. People like Soames. Let's talk about Soames for a moment, because his emotional reaction is often overlooked. He wasn't scandalized. He wasn't morally outraged. He wasn't judgmental. He was frightened. Not frightened for himself, frightened for Charles. Because Soames had watched the young Prince of Wales stumble under the weight of expectation. He watched Charles lose the woman the world adored. He watched the palace turn into a battlefield of emotion, betrayal, and bitterness.